Now let's go ahead with the factors determining demand, factors influencing demand. What actually influences demand? Let's see. Price of the product. Now, price of the product is the biggest determinant of demand. It is the first and foremost determinant of demand. We purchase those commodities, those products, the price of which is lower. And when the price increases, we tend to reduce the consumption. We tend to reduce the quantity purchased of those goods. So price is the prima facie determining factor of demand. Next is price of related good. Now we've already done this point in our last video. Now let us do this point in detail. Related goods are of two types. First, complementary goods. Second is substitutes. Now what are complementary goods? Complementary goods are those goods which are consumed together, which have a joint demand, which complete each other or complement each other. For example, tea and sugar. Can you drink tea without sugar? You possibly can't. You want sugar in your tea. So tea and sugar are consumed together. Sugar is what completes tea. So we can say tea and sugar are complementary goods. Likewise, pen and ink are also complementary goods, because when you buy a pen, you also buy ink with it. A pen cannot be used without ink. So we can say pen and ink are complementary goods. They complete each other. Now what are substitutes or competing goods? Substitutes are those goods which fight with each other for consumption, which can be substituted or replaced by some other good. For example, tea and coffee. You can easily replace tea with coffee. You either drink tea or drink coffee. You generally do not drink both. So what happens is tea can be substituted with coffee. Other example is Pepsi and Coke. Generally, people don't mind having a Pepsi or a Coke. If they get a Pepsi, they are happy with it. Or if there's no Pepsi, they'll ask for a Coke. Which means Coke is replacing Pepsi. So we can say Coke and Pepsi are substitutes of each other. You can have one in the absence of other. Now, how do these related goods determine demand? In case of complementary goods, the demand for sugar is determined by tea. If more and more people drink tea, more and more sugar would be required. More and more sugar would be demanded. Likewise, if more and more people buy pen, more ink would be demanded in those pens. So we can say the demand for sugar is determined by the demand for tea. Again, demand for ink is determined by demand for pen. Now, how is it in case of substitutes? Consumption of one good leads to less of consumption of other good. So if people drink more and more tea, they'll demand less quantities of coffee. Again, if people drink more and more Pepsi, they'll demand lesser quantities of Coke. So we can say demand of coffee is determined by demand for tea. If people will be consuming more tea, demand for coffee will be less. Again, demand for Coke is determined by demand for Pepsi. If Pepsi is demanded more, Coke will be demanded less, and vice versa. Next point, income of the household. Now, we've already discussed this thing, income of the household. More would be the income of the household, more would be the demand for goods, more would be the consumption of goods. As the income of the household rises, his consumption level also rises. As the person starts earning more and more, he tends to spend more and more. In short, he tends to demand more and more. So, his income directly affects demand. His income directly determines demand. Next, taste and preference of the consumer. Taste, habits, preferences, these things also matter a lot. If I am a consumer who wears shoes of Bata only, so I will demand only the shoes of Bata. What will happen is, if there are more people who wear Bata shoes, there will be more demand for Bata shoes. Or if there is a trend of, let's say, a particular brand of jeans or a particular style of jeans, so what we do is we tend to follow the trend, we tend to follow the fashion. So what happens is, when the trend is in, we tend to purchase more and more of that product. So we see that the habits, the trends, the fashion, the preference of the consumer impacts demand. There are some other factors also which go into determining demand. We'll discuss in detail about those. Now let's see each of these determinants. Let's discuss each of these determinants in detail.